Late last night, another 1,452 documents, files, and other items were handed over to prosecutors in the Southern District of New York. These are not special counsel Robert Mueller's prosecutors. These are federal prosecutors in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Manhattan. These 1,400 some odd items were handed over to prosecutors by the special master who is reviewing evidence in the criminal investigation of Michael Cohen, the president's longtime personal attorney and a longtime executive at the president's business, the Trump Organization. Now, these 1,400 plus documents are items that Michael Cohen's lawyers and or President Trump's lawyers had actually singled out and said these documents were privileged and they should not be given to prosecutors. Late last night, the special master who's dealing with the evidence in that case disagreed. She rejected that claim that these items were privileged and instead said, nope, these items are not privileged. They are going to prosecutors despite your objections. Now, no criminal charges have been brought against Cohen, but he is the subject of an active criminal investigation, which gave rise to the search warrants which were used to obtain all of these millions of documents from his home and his office and his safety deposit box, even from a hotel room in which he was living. And we've had weeks and weeks now of back and forth in court over whether federal prosecutors would actually get to see this stuff that was seized, whether they'd get to see and use these documents and files taken from Cohen under those search warrants. Cohen has been arguing that some of these documents can't go to prosecutors because he's an attorney, and some of the documents that were seized by the government represent confidential communications between him and his clients. And therefore, they should not be handed over to prosecutors. Prosecutors should never see them. We've had weeks of wrangling over whether this stuff is privileged. You might remember at the very start of this, right after Cohen was raided, his legal team started off in court claiming that millions of the documents that were seized would turn out to be privileged. They'd turn out to be covered by attorney-client privilege, and so prosecutors wouldn't be allowed to see them. That's what they said right off the bat in court. It has not worked out that way at all. Almost everything that was seized from Michael Cohen has been reviewed by this special master who's overseeing the evidence in this case. And upon her review, ultimately, almost nothing has been found to be covered by attorney-client privilege. As a consequence of that, almost everything seized from Michael Cohen has been handed over to prosecutors who, as we speak, are using that evidence and anything else they've turned up in their investigation to decide whether or not they are going to bring federal criminal charges against Michael Cohen. Now, that said, you are about to hear some new reporting right here, right now, that says that one very, very newsworthy item that was seized from Michael Cohen as part of this process, it actually is one of the few items in this case that was marked privileged, that was considered to be an attorney-client privileged communication that prosecutors could not get. Again, in the grand scheme of things, almost nothing was labeled by the special master as, okay, yeah, that's privileged, prosecutors can't get it. But this item that you have heard so much about today actually was labeled privileged. This is the tape that you have heard so much about today, in which Michael Cohen is said to have recorded himself talking in person with Donald Trump in September 2016, 2 months before the election. They're talking reportedly about a $150,000 payment that was made to a woman named Karen McDougal. Karen McDougal says she didn't have a one-off sexual encounter with Donald Trump, nor is this one of his sexual harassment or sexual abuse allegations. Ms. McDougal rather says she actually had a long, consensual affair with Donald Trump shortly after he married the woman who is now First Lady, Melania Trump. Now, the president's friends at the supermarket tabloid, the National Enquirer, they paid Karen McDougal $150,000 in August 2016, so a month before this taped conversation we learned about today. And that payment from the National Enquirer to Karen McDougal in August 2016, that appears to have been sort of a hush money variation, kind of a riff on the hush money theme. It was a payment that quite clearly that publication made to benefit then presidential candidate Donald Trump. But the question is exactly how. They paid Karen McDougal for exclusive rights to the story of her alleged long affair with candidate Trump. They then didn't publish that story, right? So bottom line, it's hush money. She gets paid and the story goes away. Then a few weeks later, Trump gets elected president. Ta-da. But there's open questions as to the nature of that payment and potential criminal liability that may attend to that payment. And now the New York Times has broken the story today that a tape exists of Michael Cohen and the president talking about that payment. And there's one part of this story that is really important now to understanding why we've all learned about this today and what it might mean and who might conceivably be in trouble because of it. Deep into their story today, the Times noted this, quote, Mr. Cohen's lawyers discovered the recording as part of their review of the materials seized from Cohen's home and office. And Cohen's lawyers then shared it with Mr. Trump's lawyers. The Times cites 3 people briefed on the matter in order to make that claim. So there's this open criminal investigation into the president's lawyer, Michael Cohen. As part of that investigation, the FBI seizes tons of stuff from him. Among the things that were seized was this recording that Cohen apparently made of himself talking with candidate Trump about this payment. Over this weeks-long, now months-long back and forth process that we've all been able to watch, where this court has been reviewing all the stuff that was seized from Cohen to figure out which of it should be considered attorney-client privilege, Cohen's attorneys apparently came across this recording as one of the items seized. They reviewed it. They shared it with Donald Trump's attorneys. If this new reporting that we've got tonight from Emily Jane Fox at Vanity Fair is true, that this tape was marked privileged, that means a very specific thing. That means prosecutors would never have gotten it. So that means the only people who would have had access to this thing are Michael Cohen's lawyers and President Trump's lawyers. And Michael Cohen's lawyers apparently didn't leak this thing to the New York Times today, which means, by process of elimination, that President Trump's lawyers did. So there's been all this sort of breathless reporting today. Oh, look what they got on Trump. Oh, this looks so bad for Trump. You know what? Don't get your chain yanked on this one. What appears to have happened here is that President Trump's lawyers found out this tape existed. For obvious reasons, they apparently realized it might be a potentially pretty ugly thing for the president to have exposed or have brought up in court as a surprise. And so today, the president's lawyers themselves appeared to have leaked the existence of this tape to get out ahead of this story. And so, yeah, the story appears to be real. Today is the day in American history where we get this headline about the FBI seizing a tape of the president discussing a secret payment to a Playboy model right before the election, right? But you should know that the reason we got those headlines today is because the president's legal team decided that you should see this story today. They did it themselves. And you can think of a few rational reasons why they might have done that. I mean, number one, I have no idea if this was in their mind, but this does put something else on the front page for once after 5 straight days of, hey, is the president actively working as an agent of the Russian government? I mean, this has been treason week, right? The subordination of the president to the Russian government has been the story of the week, which has not gotten better over the course of this week. Today, it did get supplanted a little bit by reports about this lurid tape. And yeah, these reports today are about a new Trump scandal, too, but at least it's a different scandal than whether or not he's controlled by Russia. So that's one effect of this action today. Also, by releasing this story themselves today, the president's lawyers, I think, hoped to shape the narrative about this tape and thereby lessen its impact if it had arrived later on as a surprise. One of the president's lawyers, Rudy Giuliani, literally tried to sell reporters today that the whole point of this tape was, quote, in the big scheme of things, well, it's pretty powerful exculpatory evidence. Actually, it's the president on tape talking about paying off a Playboy model who he says he previously definitely didn't have an affair with and he had no idea she was paid. I mean, this is a lot of things. It's not exculpatory. But I think the president's lawyers are assuming that if they could release this information on their own time and put their own kind of spin on it, however ridiculous, maybe somebody will be dumb enough to believe that. So I think they're trying to get out ahead of this story so it's their story and no one else's. Here's another dynamic at work here, though, which makes this new reporting that we've got from Emily Jane Fox really important. The special master who has been reviewing the evidence in the Michael Cohen criminal investigation, she has processed millions of documents already, right? She's handed, as I said, almost all of them over to the prosecutors in the Southern District of New York. Those prosecutors have been weighing that evidence while they decide whether or not they're going to bring criminal charges against Michael Cohen. That process has been going on for a long time. It will not go on indefinitely. it will come to a close. And then, if prosecutors are going to bring charges, Mr. Cohen and his lawyers will have to start talking to those prosecutors about the kinds of charges Cohen might face and the prospect that he might try to get a break from the government, might try to get some lenience from the government in exchange for his cooperation. And cooperation in this instance doesn't mean that he agrees to be nice. Cooperation in this instance means he agrees that he'll give them some information. Information that would be of greater value to those prosecutors than whatever value they might see in putting him in jail. You know, if they've got the goods on you and you're facing serious charges, you've got to have something really good to give them in order to persuade those prosecutors to accept that information you're giving them in exchange for not nailing you to the wall. Right? The worse trouble you're in, the better story you've got to be able to give prosecutors about something else that really matters to them. Well, if one of the things that Michael Cohen had was a recording of the president 2 months before the election discussing a secret payment to a Playboy model to avoid the disclosure of his alleged extramarital affair with her right before the election, after he had publicly denied both the affair and any knowledge of any such payment to her, that might conceivably be seen by prosecutors as a valuable thing that Michael Cohen could provide to them, that he could testify about, he could talk to them about. Remember, if this recording was in fact marked privilege, that means prosecutors didn't have it. Michael Cohen had it. Michael Cohen was in a position to potentially make that available to them. But instead, the president's lawyers leaked the existence of this tape and made it public anyway. And in doing so, Trump's lawyers have essentially taken this away as something that Michael Cohen might have otherwise been exclusively able to offer prosecutors for their pursuit of any other charges and any other people who they might be interested in. Michael Cohen would need to be able to give prosecutors something really valuable that only he could give them in order to get a really good deal from prosecutors. Right? This presumably reduces Michael Cohen's chances of getting any sort of great deal, at least to the extent that it hinged on this piece of evidence that he could give them about the president. Now, obviously, the president, right before the election, talking about a secret payout to a Playboy model, right? It's definitely of lurid interest. It's potentially of political importance. Would it be of interest legally to prosecutors? We don't know for sure, and we probably won't know until we see if this thing comes up in court or in an indictment. But there's a number of ways in which this reported discussion of a payment to Karen McDougal might conceivably end up being legally consequential for the president. And this is just, right? This is in the abstract, given what we know of the described conversation. I mean, starting with the least serious, this may impact the president's financial disclosure forms. The president's lawyer today, Rudy Giuliani, suggested that this conversation on the tape was about whether or not Trump should reimburse the National Enquirer for that payment that the publication made to Karen McDougal. If so, that might indicate that that $150,000 payment was made to her on Donald Trump's behalf, and he'd always intended on paying it back. In that case, it was a loan to him. Any such loan should have been disclosed on his financial disclosure forms. So there's that. Moving up the ladder in terms of seriousness, the payment could also potentially put the president on the hook legally in terms of campaign finance violations. If that payment was made to influence the outcome of the election by protecting Trump from the embarrassment of the disclosure of this affair right before voters went to the polls, that payment would in effect be a campaign donation. And not processing that kind of donation properly, accepting a donation that large in contravention of federal election laws, right? That's the sort of thing that most of the time, honestly, just gets you a slap on the wrist and a fine. But if it was a knowing, willful violation, that could be a criminal matter for the president. The kind of thing for which a person could go to jail. Stick a pin in that for a moment. We will come back to that. I mean, further up the chain in terms of more serious consequences, depending on the exact nature of that payment and the so-called contract that Karen McDougal entered into with the National Enquirer on the president's behalf, there's also the possibility that fraud could be a relevant consideration here. If that contract was fraudulently drawn up, so it was not really what it said it was for, criminal fraud could potentially be implicated here. As a close cousin to that, there's also the possibility that there could be money laundering concerns here. If the source of the funds was disguised or the ultimate recipient of the funds was disguised, so it looks like somebody else's money is moving through these channels, going somewhere else other than where it's actually going, that could potentially be money laundering. Now, if any of those potential charges were going to be pursued here around this hush money payment. For a number of them, particularly that campaign finance possibility, prosecutors would also likely need testimony or some other kind of evidence that would show the mindset of the people involved in this alleged crime when these violations were committed. If and when this tape turns up at a criminal trial, you might expect that Michael Cohen would end up on the stand testifying as to the authenticity of this tape and the context of this discussion. If there are criminal liabilities associated with this conversation, you might expect that Mr. Cohen and the other person in this conversation might both end up being called to testify as to what this conversation was about, what they understood it to be about, what they meant, whether they acted on what was described in the conversation. Michael Cohen was one of the two parties in this conversation. The president was the other person. I mean, learning about the existence of this tape was good for 1,001 headlines today, right? The American people actually hearing this tape will presumably result in an even larger impact if and when that happens. But imagine how the White House must feel tonight about the prospect of President Trump having to testify in court or before a grand jury as to that payment, the meaning of this conversation, whether or not it implicates him in criminal behavior. I mean, because of the privilege issues here, because of who had access to this thing, it really looks like it's the president's own legal team that put this out today in order to try to get ahead of this story. And maybe in so doing, they have reduced the chances that Michael Cohen will flip and turn state's evidence against the president. But the prospect that the president will end up in legal wrangling about these types of payments and cover-ups, it's got to be an uncomfortable prospect for this White House. I mean, this isn't the Russia scandal, right, at all. But for all the reporting that we've seen, that the White House in some ways is more scared about the Michael Cohen case than they are about the Russia case. I mean, this is why, right? We now know there's at least one tape of Trump and Cohen talking about stuff the president has publicly denied. And apparently the president didn't know that tape recording existed till it turned up in what was seized by the FBI. And that brings us to just one last point. The only way this is not a great source of agita tonight in the White House, right, is if the president is pretty sure that he won't ever get questioned about this stuff. If the president has some reason to believe that, you know what, push comes to shove, we'll litigate this to the end, but in the end, I know I'm not going to be bothered or touched in any way by this, by any civil inquiry, by any criminal inquiry on this or any other matter while I'm president. If the president is pretty well assured of that being the final word on whether or not this stuff is going to get to him as president, that would be a great load off the White House's mind at a time like this. Well, there is a magic wand that the president is trying to wave in order to get that for his presidency. That magic wand is named Brett Kavanaugh. He's the president's Supreme Court nominee. Quote, Mr. Trump's choice for the court, Judge Brett Kavanaugh, has expressed strong support for executive power, hostility to administrative agencies, support for gun rights and religious freedom. These are all conventional positions among conservative lawyers and judges. But there is one stance that sets Judge Kavanaugh apart, and it could not be more timely. His deep skepticism of the wisdom of forcing a sitting president to answer questions in criminal cases. Quote, it is not at all far-fetched to think that the question of whether President Trump must respond to a subpoena could come before the Supreme Court shortly after the confirmation process for the next justice, says Walter Dellinger, former acting Solicitor General of the United States. Quote, I do not know of any judge who has staked out as strong a position on presidential immunity, even from questioning, as Judge Kavanaugh has. And I know this is different parts of the universe crashing into each other, right? But this is where these things overlap, right? The Russia scandal, the Michael Cohen mishigas, the pending Supreme Court nomination. I mean, Sally Yates was on our air last night saying, you know what? The White House absolutely was aware that Flynn was the subject of an open investigation when the president went to the FBI director and pressured the FBI to end that investigation. Can the president be questioned about whether or not that was obstruction of justice? I mean, Sally Yates said last night he was certainly trying to influence that open FBI investigation. Was that actually criminal obstruction? When does the president get asked about that? On the Michael Cohen case, if on this tape the president is heard planning to reimburse this publication that paid off his alleged mistress because they wanted to keep her story out of the press before the election, was that a criminal campaign finance violation of the kind that could actually put a guy in jail? Could that hush money payment, which the president apparently lied about and said he didn't know about, could it further criminally implicate him in terms of fraud or money laundering or anything more serious? I mean, completely separate and apart from whether or not he and his campaign were involved in the Russia attack, the other big story this week, right? These other things are absolutely live, active criminal inquiries at this moment. And here's the president's nominee for this Supreme Court in this environment. Here he is in his own words, quote, "We should not burden a sitting president with civil suits, criminal investigations, or criminal prosecutions. I believe that the president should be excused from some of the burdens of ordinary citizenship while serving in office. Congress should enact a law, quote, providing that any personal civil suits against presidents be deferred while the president is in office. Quote, Congress should consider doing the same with respect to criminal investigations and prosecutions of the president. A president while in office should be, quote, exempt from criminal prosecution and investigation, including being exempt from questioning by criminal prosecutors or defense counsel. Quote, even the lesser burdens of a criminal investigation, including preparing for questioning by criminal investigators, those things are time-consuming and distracting. Like civil suits, criminal investigations take the president's focus away from his or her responsibilities to the people. Moreover, the indictment and trial of a sitting president would cripple the federal government. Such an outcome would ill-serve the public interest." How'd you pick that guy? With the Russia investigation, with the obstruction of justice investigation related to the Russia investigation, with the Michael Cohen investigation, with the president's lawyers now learning the hard way that in the Michael Cohen investigation, Lordy, there are tapes of the president. How do you think President Trump alighted on Brett Kavanaugh, of all people, to be his nominee to the Supreme Court? Emily Jane Fox from Vanity Fair joins us next.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.